Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we skip the surface noise and cut straight to the core mechanics of how the world works, or, in today's specific case, how the entire economic system seems to be structured to, well, periodically fracture.
That's right. Today, we are embarking on a really crucial systemic critique of modern capitalism. We're drawing extensively from the work of the economist Richard D. Wolff, specifically his comprehensive analysis in Capitalism Hits the Fan.
And our mission here isn't just to revisit the drama of the late 2000s, the foreclosures, the bailouts, all those chaotic headlines we remember.
Right.
That's just the visible symptom. We're going to try to trace this crisis back to its deepest, most fundamental origins. We're hunting for the structural roots of instability that make these crises, well, not random accidents, but predictable, recurring features of the system itself.
Exactly. And Wolff's central claim really forces us to look past the usual suspects, the greedy bankers or irresponsible borrowers. We have to focus on the decades leading up to the crash. The crisis, he argues, is entirely systemic, and its roots solidified in a fundamental structural shift that took place about 5 decades ago, starting in the mid-1970s.
And this shift, you're saying it was the moment when the century-long steady increase in the average real wages of U.S. workers just stopped permanently.
Yes.
That sounds like a kind of obscure technical detail, but you're suggesting this sea change in wages was the single point of failure, the thing that required the system to substitute debt for income, leading directly to the speculative boom and then the implosion.
Precisely. We are talking about a major hinge moment in economic history. You could call it the end of the post-World War II deal. And it had staggering social and economic consequences, yet it went largely undebated, almost unrecognized by the public and mainstream political parties.
So to understand this current era of, chronic instability, massive inequality, and the recurring need for bailouts, we have to start there.
We have to. At the moment, the foundational economic promise of modern American life was broken.
Okay, let's unpack this structural shift, what Wolff calls the end of rising wages. We should probably remind ourselves of the historical context here.
Please.
For nearly 150 years in the U.S., from the 1820s right up until the early 1970s, the basic expectation was that if you were a working person, your real wages, adjusted for inflation and cost of living, would generally rise, decade over decade.
That rising wage was the absolute bedrock of upward mobility. It was the material foundation of the American dream, as we call it. If you worked in 1950, you could fully expect that by 1970, you would be materially better off.
Right, and your kids would start their lives from a higher baseline.
An even higher baseline standard of living, exactly.
Yeah.
But starting around 1970, that historical escalator just seized up.
Yeah.
Completely. And the data illustrating this stagnation, especially when you hold it up next to corporate output, it's almost unbelievable.
So let's get into the specifics on that data, because this is where the dynamic of exploitation, as Wolff defines it, the appropriation of surplus value, it becomes undeniably stark.
It really does.
We are looking at this 32-year period between 1973 and 2005. The vast majority of the U.S. labor force, we're talking about the 80% of workers in non-supervisory jobs, they saw their real hourly wages rise by a shocking, almost negligible amount.
Just 2%.
A mere 2% over 3 decades.
Think about that reality for a second. An inflation-adjusted increase from $15.76 to $16.11 an hour over an entire working generation. This is, for all intents and purposes, stagnation.
Complete stagnation.
And if you look beyond just the hourly wage to weekly pay, the situation is actually even grimmer.
That's so.
Due to shifts in the structure of work, fewer hours, less stable jobs, their real weekly pay declined by 6.5% over the same period.
So after 30 years of working, the majority of the population could actually afford less than they could when they started. And that calculation doesn't even factor in the skyrocketing costs of things like healthcare and college tuition.
Which also started outpacing inflation right around the same time.
Right. But crucially, this stagnation, it didn't happen because workers became less efficient or, lazier.
Quite the opposite. At the exact same time, wages flatlined worker productivity. That's the real output generated per worker hour.
Yeah.
It didn't just stall, it exploded. Output per worker soared by a massive 75%.
Okay, so there it is. That's the gap. This is where the systemic critique lands hardest and where we really need to unpack the mechanisms of power. How did corporations manage to pull off this economic magic trick?
Well, it wasn't magic. It was a fundamental shift in the power dynamic in the workplace and in the economy as a whole. Corporations were extracting 75% more output per worker,
Mm-hmm.
but were paying those workers virtually nothing more for it. This enormous widening gap between what workers produced and what they were paid, that's the structural source of the crisis.
And it led directly to...
Exploding corporate profits and massive capital accumulation right at the top. I mean, this is the very definition of exploitation getting worse. The surplus appropriated by capitalist employers rose dramatically, while workers essentially funded the entire increase in national wealth without seeing any personal benefit from it.
So what fueled that productivity rise? Was it purely technology, computers and robots and all that?
Technology certainly helped, of course, but it was also fueled by an increased intensity of work, what used to be called speed-ups, and the structural threat of outsourcing.
Ah, okay.
Throughout the 70s and 80s, you had the decline of union density, which was huge. That, coupled with the increasing feasibility of just shifting production overseas, meant that employers faced very little pushback when demanding greater output without corresponding rank increases.
They held all the cards.
They had all the leverage. They could basically say, accept this stagnant wage and work faster, or we'll replace you with a machine or move the job to a low-wage country. And workers knew it.
So on one side of the ledger, you have this massive increase in corporate profits just piling up. And on the other, you have a working population whose wages are frozen, but who were, culturally programmed for rising consumption.
Exactly. The American dream didn't just disappear from people's minds.
So if the traditional mechanism for prosperity rising income was shut down, how did U.S. consumerism continue? Why didn't it just collapse immediately?
That is the pivotal question. The impending crisis of underconsumption, because workers couldn't afford to buy back what they produced, was temporarily postponed
Ow.
by a desperate two-part individual coping mechanism that was adopted by working-class families all across the country.
The first part was they simply worked more. They had to inject more labor hours into the system just to stay in place financially.
Correct. We saw a massive structural increase in labor participation. The most notable part of that was the entry of millions of women into the paid labor force, often driven by sheer economic necessity rather than solely career aspirations. On top of that, you had individuals taking on second or third jobs, working more overtime. The total result was that the average working family injected about 20% more labor hours per year into the economy compared to 1975.
They were essentially trading time, leisure, and family stability for continued consumption. They were trying to fill that wage gap with raw hours of human effort.
And that choice carried immense social costs. You're talking about stress, exhaustion, time poverty, increased interpersonal tension within families. It was brutal.
But even working 20% more wasn't enough.
It wasn't enough to sustain the expected standard of living, especially as things like housing and education costs began to skyrocket. So they moved to the second, much more dangerous response, a massive, unprecedented explosion of debt.
They started relying on every tool they could find: credit cards, home equity lines of credit, auto loans, refinanced mortgages, anything to maintain the lifestyle that their stagnant wages could no longer support.
They were delaying the inevitable fall in their living standards by mortgaging their future, literally.
And the numbers detailing this explosion of debt, they're pretty hard to wrap your head around.
They're monumental. According to Federal Reserve data, personal debt, and that includes consumer debt and mortgages, it skyrocketed from $627 billion in 1974
Right.
to an unthinkable $9,709 billion by 2004.
Let's say that again. From $600 billion to almost $10 trillion.
That's a 15-fold increase.
15-fold. That is an exponential rise in liability built on top of flat income. It's a recipe for disaster.
And you can measure the immediate consequence of this with something called the debt service ratio. That's just the percentage of after-tax income that households have to dedicate just to meeting their minimum debt payments.
And what happened to that?
By the second quarter of 2005, this ratio reached 13.6%. To put that in context, that was the highest figure since the Fed began recording that statistic back in 1980. This wasn't just a heavy debt load. It was a permanent systemic pressure cooker.
And this translates directly into crippling social costs. I mean, financial anxiety drives family breakdown, alienation, a general feeling of instability, even during the supposed boom years.
Absolutely.
And what's truly I don't know, pathological here is how the capitalist class, who benefited from the wage stagnation, then managed to profit again from the resulting worker pain.
Right. This gets us to the speculative loop, or what Wolff calls the double squeeze.
The double squeeze. Okay, break that down for us.
It's the structural genius, or you could say the systemic pathology of late capitalism. Capitalists profited in two distinct sequential ways. First, they extracted soaring profits, the surplus, by keeping wages stagnant despite that 75% rise in productivity.
Okay, that's squeeze number one, exploitation at the point of production.
Exactly. Then, for squeeze number two, they took those massive profits and they turned right around
Uh-huh.
and loaned part of that surplus back to the same workers in the form of high-interest mortgages and consumer loans.
So the worker is squeezed as a producer with the stagnant wage, and then squeezed again as a consumer and a borrower with high debt payments.
Precisely. But the speculative loop doesn't even stop there. The final step was the financial alchemy of Wall Street.
Right.
Corporations and banks took those soaring profits derived from the stagnant wages and used them to invest in complex new securities, you've heard of them, mortgage-backed securities, MBSs, and collateralized debt obligations,
Right.
CDOs.
And these securities were backed by the very worker debt they had just issued.
Yes. So the system was essentially selling packages of highly leveraged debt, all based on the assumption that workers would somehow magically keep making payments on loans they couldn't actually afford based on their real income.
This whole process, financialization, it created an entire ecosystem built on a house of cards made of debt.
It was a self-reinforcing dependency. The double squeeze on the working class, exploited in the workplace, exploited again in the credit market, that was the foundation for the entire economic boom that lasted from the 1970s all the way through 2006.
And once the payments started to fail, which was just inevitable when income hadn't risen in 30 years, that entire debt-based structure, the MBSs, the CDOs, and the banks holding them, it all inevitably began imploding around 2006 and 2007. So the implosion of that debt house of cards didn't just affect stock prices on Wall Street. It manifested as a systemic erosion of the social and public structures that people traditionally relied on for security.
That's right.
Let's look first at the iconic failure of the promise of prosperity, the reversal of the American dream through the housing crisis.
For generations, the home was the primary asset. It was the safety net, the principal stirrer of value Americans accumulated. It represented financial security and, something tangible to pass on to your kids.
But this massive debt structure changed the nature of homeownership, fundamentally.
It shifted it from a vehicle for building equity to a commodity for liquidation.
And we saw this structural shift where families were continually encouraged, often very aggressively, to liquidate their hard-earned equity refinancing over and over, taking out home equity lines of credit just to sustain their current consumption in the face of those stagnant wages.
And the clearest, most heartbreaking example of this desperation and the shattering of intergenerational wealth that came with it is the dramatic rise of reverse mortgages.
Right. For anyone who's not familiar, can you just quickly explain what that is?
Sure. A reverse mortgage allows people, typically seniors, to borrow money against the value of their primary residence. They receive payments, either monthly or as a lump sum, but in return, the lender acquires rising equity in the home.
So you're basically turning your home into a temporary bank account. But the cost is that eventually the home has to be sold to repay the principal and all the accumulated interest.
Which means the inheritance vanishes.
Gone.
And the statistics here are incredibly telling about the financial stress faced by retired and near-retired Americans. In 1990, only 150 reverse mortgages were arranged nationwide.
150.
Okay. But by 2007, just 17 years later, industry officials expected around 120,000 to be signed annually.
Wow. That explosion.
Yeah.
It's not a sign of financial sophistication.
No, it's a sign that traditional retirement tools, IRAs, 401k, private pensions, they simply were not providing sufficient income to cover living expenses and those skyrocketing healthcare costs.
So you're saying that the economic realities created by decades of flat wages forced the elderly to cannibalize the single primary asset they had spent their entire lives building just to fund their final years of life.
Precisely. They were forced to monetize their homes. As Peter Bell of the National Reverse Mortgage Lenders Association reluctantly noted at the time, seniors recognized that their homes were the only remaining asset large enough to generate the cash needed for current expenses.
And the consequence is that the widespread expectation that children will inherit their parents' homes, a core tenet of the American dream, is systematically being undermined.
It is.
And the result of all this refinancing and leveraging was that by 2008, the average U.S. homeowner typically owned only about 40% of their home's stated value. The other 60% belonged to the mortgage lender.
It dramatically altered the psychological reality of owning a home. You're no longer a secure owner building equity. You're more like an insecure renter who's just paying the lender indefinitely.
Okay, so moving beyond housing, we see this erosion impacting other foundational safety nets. Let's talk about pensions.
Yes, this is a quiet but massive capitalist disaster where both public and private sector pensions are severely structurally underfunded. Estimates place the shortfall around $450 billion in the private sector and at least $300 billion in the public sector in the period leading up to the crisis.
Why are they so underfunded? Is it just poor planning, or is there something more systemic going on?
It's systemic. It's rooted in the incentive structure of the corporation. For decades, corporations had a powerful incentive to underfund their pension obligations because by doing so, they immediately boosted their short-term reported profits.
Which makes their stock look better, enriches executives through bonuses.
Exactly. And it allowed them to divert cash flow to other, more immediately profitable ventures rather than responsibly saving for future liabilities.
So when the chickens come home to roost, when the baby boomers start retiring and they demand those payments, the workers are stuck in a double bind. They lose either way.
They absolutely are. They lose through immediate benefit cuts, or they lose later through reduced federal programs or new local and state tax bills needed to cover the shortfalls of those underfunded public sector pensions.
Right.
Meanwhile, the corporations that benefited handsomely from decades of using pension funds as basically interest-free loans, they largely avoid any significant reparations.
They privatize the profits from underfunding and socialize the costs of the shortfall.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay, let's shift our attention to another major consequence of the stagnant wage crisis. The structural decline of public higher education, which is so crucial for intergenerational mobility. When incomes are frozen, but the credential you need for a decent job, a college degree, is increasingly necessary, the cost of that education becomes a disproportionate and destructive burden on families.
This is a perfect illustration of how the structural squeeze just ripples through society. The rising cost of public higher education didn't happen in a vacuum. It was a direct response to states and localities pulling back funding, often under the ideological banner of neoliberal policies demanding cost-cutting and privatization.
Let's use the specific example you brought up from the book, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst.
Okay. Between 1978 and 2007, the total cost for in-state undergraduate students at UMass Amherst rose 3 times faster than the Consumer Price Index.
Wait, 3 times faster? Not just a little bit faster, but 3 times. What does that actually mean for a family trying to budget?
It means it's impossible. This wasn't because the quality of education improved threefold. It was primarily because state support was slashed, forcing universities to raise tuition dramatically just to cover their basic operating costs.
And the consequence of that accelerating cost, combined with frozen parental incomes, is the massive student debt load we see today.
Yes, massive student debt. In 2005, the average debt load for graduating students at public schools was $15,500. Today, those numbers are much, much higher, but the trend started then.
Right.
And this phenomenon fuels a kind of middle-class malaise that often gets misdiagnosed in political debates. People start blaming the university administration or the professors or the students themselves rather than tracing the problem back to the stagnant wages of the parents and the withdrawal of public funding.
And this cost-cutting pressure degrades the educational experience from the inside out, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It creates a bifurcated, two-tiered system. To save costs, public universities replace higher-paid, secure, tenured faculty with huge numbers of overworked, underpaid adjuncts who receive no benefits and little to no job security.
So the tenure-track jobs just vanish.
They vanish, and faculty have less time for research and essential student engagement because they're stretched so thin.
And then, as you mentioned, we see the proliferation of solutions like distance learning or massive online courses, which are sold as these great efficiency measures.
But are often just profit opportunities for the universities, administered by those same low-paid adjuncts. The result is a hardening of the division between first-class, well-resourced private education, often accessible only to the wealthy, and an increasingly second-class public system.
The democratization of higher education, that's being systematically unraveled.
It is, due to the wage crisis combined with defunding.
Okay, we see this erosion extended to what might be the most cynical manifestation of government financing, which brings us to the critique of regressive taxation, specifically state lotteries.
State lotteries are often marketed with two really positive-sounding outcomes. They are fun games, and they raise money for essential public services, almost always education.
Right, for the children.
Exactly. But Wolff argues they are, in fact, a disguised tax injustice.
Explain that injustice. How do they function as a regressive tax?
They are entirely regressive because they take a disproportionately large percentage of income from those who are least able to afford it. Data consistently shows that the poor and the lower middle class are the primary customers.
Hmm.
Households with annual incomes below $25,000, for instance, spend an average of nearly $600 per year on lottery tickets. Now, compare that to affluent households earning over $100,000 who averaged only $289.
So they're essentially a state-sponsored extraction of wealth from the poor.
That's what it is.
So why do politicians consistently promote them instead of just raising tax rates on corporations or the wealthy, which would be far more economically efficient?
Well, the political function is insidious, and it serves the capitalist system perfectly. First, they allow politicians to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for public services, often education, without the political risk of taxing corporations or the wealthy, who are key campaign donors and lobbyists.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second reason?
Second, and this is perhaps more powerful ideologically, they reinforce the idea that individual gambling, the faint hope for a personal, sudden escape from debt and hardship, is the appropriate response to the economic crisis.
So instead of focusing energy on collective action, like organizing for higher wages or demanding wealth redistribution, the state sells this fantasy that you might win your way out of poverty.
And that distracts from the systemic failures that created the poverty in the first place. It replaces systemic solution-seeking with individual hope.
And on top of all that, lotteries are the exact opposite of an economic stimulus.
They are. They extract huge sums from masses of people who, if they kept that money, would spend it on local goods and services, which generates real jobs. Instead, the lottery concentrates that wealth into the hands of a few winners, leading to less productive economic activity overall.
We've established that the economic crisis of stagnant wages and exploding debt is deeply structural, not just accidental. So why have mainstream political debates consistently failed to diagnose it properly? Why do we, every generation, seem to recycle the same ineffective solutions only to face the same crisis again?
The reason is that capitalism, as a crisis-prone system, historically contains its own contradictions through what Wolff defines as structural oscillations.
Oscillations.
Yes, these oscillations act as a kind of political and economic gyroscope, swinging the system back and forth just enough to relieve pressure, but never fundamentally altering the core employer-employee relationship.
Let's detail these three interconnected oscillations. What's the first one?
The first is the economic oscillation. This is the historical swing between two forms of organizing capitalism. On one side, you have private capitalism, often termed neoliberalism, minimal state intervention, deregulation, prioritizing free markets.
Okay.
On the other, you have state interventionist capitalism, known as the welfare state, or Keynesianism, where the state actively manages demand, provides social safety nets, and imposes heavy regulation.
So after the state chooses a form, the political and cultural shifts follow that.
Exactly. The political oscillation is the corresponding swing in political power, where the party associated with the displaced economic form loses ground to the ascendant party. So, for instance, the Republicans were displaced by FDR's Democrats in the 1930s.
And the third, the cultural ideological oscillation, that dictates the public narrative.
It's the shift in accepted wisdom, what the media, the think tanks, and the academy are saying. They move from celebrating the virtues of decentralized private markets to celebrating the necessity of state management, or vice versa.
So let's trace the recent history through this lens. The crisis of 1929 hits, the consensus swings hard left towards state interventionist capitalism, leading to FDR's New Deal and decades of Keynesian dominance.
Right.
But when that model ran into trouble stagflation deficits in the 1970s, the pendulum swung back hard right to the neoliberal approach championed by Reagan and Thatcher.
Correct. These oscillations are the system's structural defense mechanism. When the private market fails catastrophically, the system switches to the state interventionist model to stabilize things. When that state model generates inefficiencies or bureaucracy, it swings back to the private market approach.
But critically, in both forms,
The core class structure is preserved.
what remains unchanged?
The core class structure remains untouched. Who controls the massive surplus? The profits, the employer-employee relationship, the fact that an unelected corporate board dictates key economic decisions like layoffs, technology, location of production. The debates are confined to more versus less government, leaving the underlying issue of exploitation in corporate democracy completely off the table.
Wait, let me challenge that premise for a moment for the listener. Isn't this oscillation simply democracy at work? I mean, critics would argue that shifting between Keynesianism and neoliberalism is the necessary correction mechanism, a dynamic response to different historical challenges. Isn't this just the political system course correcting?
That's the powerful mainstream narrative, but from Wolff's systemic perspective, it's a distraction. If these oscillations were truly corrective, they would lead to increasing stability over time, yet they haven't. They simply preserve the basic class structure, which is the source of the chronic instability.
So because the core structure remains unchanged, the corporate board still holds the power and the incentive, the crisis just inevitably recurs in a slightly different form.
Exactly. Which brings us to the crucial critique of reformism. Why do reforms, even those implemented with massive popular support, like the New Deal regulations, ultimately fail to prevent the next crisis?
Why did
The failure is embedded in the corporate structure itself, specifically in the goals of the people who run these firms. Reforms implemented after previous crashes failed because they left corporate boards of directors with two crucial things: the incentive and the resources to evade, undermine, and eventually abolish the regulations.
Okay, let's break down those two components. The incentive seems clear. Relentless pursuit of profit maximization, regardless of the social cost.
Exactly. If the law says don't take excessive risk, but taking excessive risk yields huge personal bonuses and massive shareholder returns, the incentive structure is corrupted from the very start.
And the resources, what do you mean by that?
The resources are the massive profits, that surplus that the workers generated during the boom. Corporations use this wealth to hire armies of lobbyists, fund ideological think tanks, influence politicians through campaign donations, and build sophisticated legal departments designed specifically to find loopholes or overturn the regulations put in place after the crash.
So the corporations use the very money they made during the boom that caused the crash to dismantle the guardrails put up to prevent the next one.
It's a self-defeating loop for the public. The failure is systematic.
Can you give an example of that?
We saw this illustrated in the run-up to the 2008 crash. For example, U.S. lenders were technically required to use an IRS form, the 4506T, to verify borrowers' incomes to prevent mortgage fraud.
Okay, a basic check.
A basic check. Yet most major lenders never checked, or checked only minimally, because they were making immediate, guaranteed profit by immediately reselling the risky mortgages to investment banks as part of that MBS creation machine. The regulatory system was designed to prevent fraud, but the profit incentive, combined with the resources to lobby against strict enforcement, simply overpowered it.
So the systematic failure leads Wolff to assert that repeating the mistake now, just regulating the banks and implementing another bailout, is not realism. It's absurdity because the corporate structure remains the engine of evasion.
And this sustained political and economic misdiagnosis relies heavily on a powerful ideological foundation that reinforces the status quo, which we could call evangelical economics.
That's a strong term. How does neoclassical economics function as an ideological tool rather than a neutral science?
It functions as the scientific assurance for the capitalist class. It tells the public that only good things, efficiency, prosperity, innovation, progress, result from free markets, private property, and minimal state interference. It dismisses alternatives, whether Keynesian adjustments or radical critiques like Marxism, as dangerous heresies or deviations from natural law.
So like a religious fundamentalism, evangelical economics insists on absolute faith in the market, banning dissent and serious structural debate.
Precisely. It creates a narrative where if economic failures happen, they are never due to the system's core structure. They must be due to external interference, usually by the state, or by moral failings like greedy bankers, or individual responsibility like irresponsible borrowers.
And that fundamentalism became so dominant.
It became so dominant that many key policymakers who were educated solely in this paradigm were entirely incapacitated when the 2008 crash actually hit. Their theory literally disallowed the possibility of systemic capitalist failure, causing them to act too late and propose entirely ineffective policies at first.
So the root cause of the crisis is a domestic U.S. problem stagnant wages financing consumption through unsustainable debt. But the consequences, due to decades of globalization and trade imbalance, they didn't stay contained within U.S.
No,
borders.
not at all.
So how exactly did the U.S. debt and consumption engine warp the global economy?
The core mechanism is the vast and continuous U.S. trade imbalance. For decades, the U.S. bought far more manufactured goods, oil, and consumer products than it sold overseas.
Uh-huh.
So countries like China, Japan, Germany, and the OPEC members, they accumulated vast hordes of U.S. dollars from those sales. And these dollars represent an enormous surplus of cash.
And what do global economies do with billions of surplus U.S. dollars?
They recycle them. They lend those dollars back to the U.S. by purchasing highly secure U.S. Treasury securities, T-bills, T-bonds. This process essentially financed the massive U.S. federal deficit. It kept U.S. interest rates artificially low by flooding the market with capital, and it injected an endless supply of loanable funds back into the U.S. financial system.
This sounds like a global feedback loop. Foreign countries export products to the U.S., they accumulate dollars, and then they use those dollars to finance the very U.S. debt bubble, the mortgages, the consumer credit, that enabled U.S. consumers to buy their products in the first place.
It's a self-perpetuating global dependency loop that relies on U.S. citizens taking on ever-increasing liabilities. The whole world became dependent on this system. U.S. capitalism solved its underconsumption problem, the stagnant wages, by propping up workers' purchasing power with costly loans.
And the rest of the world financed those loans to keep their export factories hunting.
Exactly. So when the U.S. debt bubble burst, the shockwaves were immediate and they were global.
Let's look at a specific, often overlooked example of these global ripples outside of the major trade partners. Let's focus on the immediate threat to a key neighbor, Mexico.
Mexico represents a classic case of an economy that relies on structural offsets to manage its own highly unequal capitalist system. Mexico's internal economic problems, high unemployment, deep poverty, are historically managed by two main escape valves.
Emigration and remittances.
Emigration and remittances. Emigration acts as a political stability mechanism. It allows Mexico to essentially export its political and social instability by sending desperate, unemployed, or underemployed workers north, relieving pressure on the domestic labor market.
And those workers then generate the second valve, remittances, the cash that immigrants send home to their families.
It acts as a crucial economic lifeline for Mexico's poorest communities. It often provides the sole source of income for entire villages.
And that lifeline grew to be massive. By 2006, remittances peaked at $24 billion.
Which was actually a larger annual inflow of money into Mexico than either foreign direct investment or tourism revenue combined.
It was a vital, non-governmental support system for the nation's economy.
It was. But as the U.S. economy slid into crisis post-2007, the effects were immediate. Unemployment soared, particularly in the U.S. construction and housing sectors, which employed a large number of recent immigrants.
Right.
Consequently, immigration slowed dramatically, and remittances began to drop, showing a noticeable 3% decline in 2008 and then rapidly accelerating downward after that.
So a slowdown in emigration combined with a drop in remittances, which kept Mexico's increasingly dysfunctional economy afloat, that threatens to just explode Mexico's economy and its social situation. It eliminates their primary social safety valve.
Yes. If the U.S. stops buying its labor stability with jobs and cheap cash transfers, the social problems that were suppressed will resurface violently. We're talking about mounting social unrest, collapsing local economies, and intensified political instability. It profoundly demonstrates how U.S. instability immediately translates into deep destabilization for its neighbors.
We also have to discuss the chronic, often geopolitical instability imposed by global oil market volatility, which Wolff views as another chronic capitalist problem.
Oil prices are fundamental to the global economy, and the U.S. economy is structurally vulnerable because its transportation system, built primarily around the private automobile, is massively oil-dependent.
Right. The U.S. consumes about 25% of the world's oil, and 60% of that is imported.
So this dependence just guarantees chronic price volatility.
What are the drivers of this volatility, beyond just simple supply and demand?
It's multi-layered. First, it's driven by giant corporations and speculators manipulating the market. Second, by nationalism and instability in oil-rich nations. The decision to nationalize or privatize reserves can send massive shockwaves. Third, and most powerfully, by aggressive geopolitics and conflict.
Like the Iraq War.
Absolutely. The volatility of oil prices after 1998 was significantly shaped by factors including OPEC supply shifts, the rapid industrial booms in China and India, Russian export policies, and critically, the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The instability generated by that conflict and the ongoing political tensions between the U.S. and oil-rich nations impose enormous uncounted costs, both economic and human, due to U.S. dependence.
So, whether we look at the double squeeze on the U.S. worker, the shattered American dream symbolized by reverse mortgages, the erosion of higher education, or the global destabilization in Mexico and the oil markets, it all traces back to the systemic nature of capitalism that requires these periodic booms and busts to function and preserve its core class structure.
That is why the political oscillation we discussed earlier, the swinging between private sector dominance and state management, is ultimately a political failure. It's an exercise in shuffling deck chairs. The system always returns to its crisis-prone setting because the fundamental power imbalance remains.
So if oscillation shifting between state and private capitalism is merely a way to preserve the system by leaving the class structure intact, then the obvious question for our listener is, what is the alternative? What is the systemic solution that actually addresses the root cause?
The fundamental problem, according to this analysis, is the profoundly undemocratic nature of the capitalist production system. Under this system, corporate boards of directors, who are responsible primarily to a minority of wealthy shareholders, make all the key economic decisions.
What to produce, where to locate production, what technology to use.
And crucially, how to distribute the surplus, the profits.
And the vast majority of people, the productive workers, they have a zero democratic input into these decisions, yet they are the ones forced to live with the consequences. Layoffs, outsourcing, stagnant wages, and these recurring crises.
Exactly. So if changing the government from conservative to liberal, or changing the degree of regulation from neoliberal to Keynesian doesn't solve the core issue of power, then we have to go deeper.
To the level of the enterprise itself.
Precisely. This is where we introduce the radical proposal: eliminating capitalism's class structure by organizing workers' self-directed enterprises, or WSDCs.
This concept, which, it echoes historical Marxist thought but applies it pragmatically to the modern enterprise, it proposes reorganizing firms to position the productive workers as their own collective board of directors,
thereby eliminating the employer-employee class relationship within the workplace. The key distinction is democracy at the point of production.
Yeah.
In a WSDC, the workers collectively make all the decisions traditionally reserved for a corporate board, from hiring and firing to how profits are allocated. They eliminate the external minority that profits from the majority's labor.
That sounds revolutionary, but what would that actually look like on a practical day-to-day level within a company, say a manufacturing plant or a tech firm?
It would require a mandated structural change in job descriptions. Imagine a scenario where the job contract mandates 4 days dedicated to production tasks: building the product, writing the code, performing the service. And 1 day, maybe Friday, is dedicated to functioning collectively as the board of directors. Every productive worker has a seat, a vote, and a voice in deciding key enterprise decisions, including investment and profit distribution.
How does that immediately change the economic dynamics compared to the traditional corporate board?
It changes the risk and reward structure, fundamentally. When workers are the directors, their decisions about capital accumulation, wages, and job security will reflect their own needs and the needs of their community, not solely the mandate of maximizing shareholder profit for an external minority.
We can trace this right back to the core problem we started with: stagnant wages. If a WSDC faces an economic downturn, the decision makers, the workers, would have a completely different set of incentives compared to a traditional CEO.
Oh, completely. A traditional corporate board, incentivized by shareholders, often responds to a downturn with massive layoffs and plant closures to preserve or boost the stock price, regardless of the community impact. A WSDC, where the workers themselves decide, would likely choose shared sacrifice. Perhaps a temporary reduction in wages or hours for all employees, including management, to maintain employment levels and community stability.
So wages and community stability suddenly become as important, if not more important, than just the profit margins.
Exactly. This shift wouldn't eliminate instability entirely because market volatility is real, but the source and nature of the instability would be handled by decision makers whose livelihoods depend directly on the well-being of the firm and the broader community. The social cost of the crisis would be distributed differently, reducing the overall pain.
And because they are in charge of distributing the surplus, they would not allow the kind of massive internal inequality that leads to wage stagnation in the first place.
Nor would they be incentivized to dismantle their own pension funds to boost short-term personal gains. The mechanism that generated the debt crisis, that double squeeze, is structurally eliminated.
So what does this systemic analysis mean for us today, especially given the history of massive government interventions and bailouts we've recently witnessed? I mean, the state literally became a temporary majority shareholder in firms deemed too big to fail, like AIG and the major banks.
This raises the fundamental provocative question that must define our future political debate. If taxpayers, you, me, the average citizen, shoulder the risks and costs of failure through these bailouts, accepting national debt and reduced services to stabilize the system,
Right.
shouldn't we, the owners of last resort, demand a fundamental democratic change in the corporate structure?
So if the public assumes the liability of corporate failure, why should we just allow the crisis-prone corporate structure to simply shift back to the old model of private, undemocratic control that guaranteed the next crash?
Why not demand democratic control over the means of production, not just temporary state intervention designed only to keep the status quo alive until the next failure?
Stability requires solving the problem of exploitation, which begins by replacing the undemocratic corporate structure itself.
Without that radical change at the level of the enterprise, we are destined to simply ride the next swing of the capitalist pendulum right into the next, inevitable and potentially even more devastating crisis.
That is a lot to think about. Connecting stagnant wages from the 1970s directly to the global political and social instability we face today, and providing a vision for genuine systemic change. This has been a crucial and comprehensive deep dive into the roots of systemic crisis.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of structural economics.
If you'd like a shorter, animated breakdown of this topic, check the description for the mini explainer video that accompanies this deep dive. And if you're watching the mini explainer first, you'll find a link to this full deep dive for a deeper exploration.